My name is Ava, and I am finally learning to speak my truth, even though every word feels like lifting a stone from a mountain I have carried for years. People often think trauma is loud, violent, and dramatic, but mine was slow, quiet, like a rope tightening around my throat one day at a time. I grew up believing that my mother, my only parent, my only home, would always fight for me. I believed loyalty lived in blood and that love was something unbreakable. I was wrong in ways that still sting. The day she closed my bedroom door behind her, something changed forever. She sat at the edge of my bed with the kind of tiredness that seemed older than her. Her hands trembled when she held them together, and her eyes avoided mine, as if looking at me would expose something she wasn't ready to say. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in the middle. Ava, we need help. You need to grow up and understand. At first I thought she meant work, school, or some responsibility I had overlooked. But then she said his name, an 80-year-old man, wealthy, known in town, and rumored to collect wives the way some men collect antiques. I stared at her, waiting for the joke, the explanation, the moment she would laugh and say she was kidding. But she didn't. The silence between us felt like a cliff I was falling off. I whispered, Mom? No. She whispered back, we don't have a choice. That was the moment I felt the ground move beneath me, as if my life no longer belonged to me, but to a decision already made without my consent. 4 days after that conversation, I walked around the house in a haze, unable to understand how my mother, my protector, could imagine giving me to a man older than both my grandfathers combined. She avoided me, drifting from room to room like a ghost ashamed of her own shadow. Sometimes I caught her staring at the bills piled on the table, or pressing the palms of her hands against her temples as if she could squeeze the pain out. I knew we were struggling, but I never imagined she saw me as a solution, a bargaining chip, a door out of her misery. At night I lay awake listening to her cry behind the thin walls of our small home, and each sob carved deeper into the fragile trust I had left. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to tell her I was her daughter, not a debt to be sold. But every time I tried to confront her, the words got stuck in my throat. Maybe part of me still hoped she would change her mind, that she would look at me and remember I was a child she raised, not a sacrifice she could offer to save herself. But as the days passed, hope faded like old wallpaper peeling from a damp wall. She wouldn't talk to me, only saying, you'll understand one day, as if the future held some twisted clarity. I felt myself shrinking, losing the edges of who I was. I avoided mirrors because I didn't want to see the fear in my eyes, or worse, the resignation. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a waiting room for something terrible that was getting closer every minute. The day he came to our house, everything inside me tightened like a fist. His car was sleek and black, kind of vehicle that looked out of place on our cracked street. When he stepped out, leaning heavily on a polished wooden cane, I felt the air grow colder around me. His smile was thin and practiced, the kind people use when they are used to being obeyed. His eyes lingered on me far too long, evaluating, measuring, claiming. I felt stripped, like he had already taken something from me without touching me. My mother stood behind me, stiff and silent, like she had become part of the wall. He held out his hand to me as if greeting a business partner, not a terrified girl. You're even prettier than she said, he murmured, and every word slithered across my skin. I wanted to run, scream, vanish, anything except stand there and pretend I didn't feel sick. I can give you a good life, he continued, his voice thick with self-satisfaction. Safety, comfort, everything a young woman should want. His definition of comfort made bile rise in my throat. I forced a polite smile because my mother's nails dug into my shoulder, urging me to behave. In that moment I realized something heartbreaking. She wasn't torn, she wasn't confused, she was determined. Determined enough to sell my future to a man who smelled of medicine, old cologne, and power. I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, where I could finally breathe. I stared at the tiles, trying to understand how my life had narrowed into a corridor with no doors. I whispered to myself, this can't be happening. But it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his visit. The way he looked at me like I was an object he had already purchased. The way my mother avoided my eyes. The way my voice trembled when I said nothing, when I should have said everything. I lay awake listening to the hum of the old refrigerator, the ticking clock, and my own heartbeat pounding like a warning drum. I thought about running away, about packing a small bag and slipping out before sunrise, but fear clung to me like a second skin. Where would I go? What would I eat? How would I survive with no money, no plan, no one to trust. The world outside felt vast and dangerous. But the world inside this house felt like a cage closing around me. I imagined a future with that man, his cold hands, his heavy breathing, his control over every decision I would ever make. I imagined losing myself piece by piece until I became someone I no longer recognized. The thought suffocated me. When I finally drifted into a shallow sleep, I dreamed of drowning in a dark lake, while my mother stood on the shore, reaching out but never stepping in. I woke up gasping, tears soaking my pillow, the dawn light barely touching the edges of my room. That's when something inside me shifted, not courage exactly, but desperation. A small, trembling voice whispered, "You must save yourself. No one else will." I clung to that voice like a lifeline. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, but I knew what it couldn't look like: me, trapped in a life chosen by someone else. At sunrise, the house was silent. My mother was asleep. Exhausted from nights of crying and decisions she had convinced herself were necessary, I stepped into the hallway, every board creaking like it wanted to betray me. My hands shook as I opened my bedroom closet and pulled out the small backpack I used for school years ago. I filled it with the bare essentials: a change of clothes, a bottle of water, a few slices of bread, and the small amount of cash I had saved secretly from occasional part-time chores. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I looked around the room one last time. The faded posters, the cracked window, the lamp that flickered when the power surged. It was the only place I had ever known, yet suddenly it felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I slipped on my shoes and tiptoed to the door. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would wake her. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. A wave of guilt crashing over me. Leaving her felt like betrayal, but staying felt like dying slowly. I whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry, Mom." Then I opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was cold, but sharp with freedom. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without feeling like something was pressing against my chest. I didn't know where I was going, only that each step away from that house was a step toward reclaiming my life. I kept walking, afraid to look back, because I knew if I did, I might lose the strength to keep going. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs trembling but my resolve solidifying with every mile I put between myself and the life I was escaping. The sun climbed slowly, warming the empty road ahead of me, yet I felt cold inside, like the fear hadn't quite loosened its grip. I reached the next town by noon, a place I had only ever seen from the window of a bus. Everything looked unfamiliar: strangers with unreadable expressions, storefronts with peeling paint, the sound of traffic humming like a foreign language. I kept my head down, clutching my backpack straps to steady myself. When I found a small park, I sat on a bench and took out the bread I had packed. The first bite caught in my throat. I hadn't realized how exhausted I was until that moment. As I ate, I watched families walking by, children laughing, people drinking coffee, all living lives that seemed impossibly normal. I wondered if they could see the fear on my face or the weight in my eyes. Part of me wanted to stand up and shout my story to the world, tell them that I had escaped being sold, that I had run for my life. But another part of me wanted invisibility, safety, silence. I needed time to figure out who I was now, away from the expectations and pressure that had shaped me. I didn't know what I would do next, but the thought of going back never crossed my mind. Even if the world ahead was uncertain, at least it was mine. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I needed shelter for the night. Wandering the streets felt dangerous, and I drew sidelong glances from people who could sense I didn't belong. I found a small cafe on the corner of an old brick street, its windows fogged from the steam of coffee and warm pastries inside. The smell alone was enough to pull me in. A woman in her late 40s stood behind the counter, her hair tied up in a messy bun, her eyes sharp but kind. She noticed my backpack, the dirt on my shoes, the exhaustion on my face. "You look like you've had a long day," she said gently. I nodded, afraid that speaking would crack something inside me. She slid a cup of hot tea toward me, without asking for payment. "Drink," she insisted. "You look like you need it." The warmth of the cup seeped into my hands and traveled through my body like comfort I hadn't felt in years. When I thanked her, my voice came out shaky, betraying how fragile I felt. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" she asked. I froze, unsure whether to lie or trust her, but her expression held no judgment, only concern. Quietly, I shook my head. She sighed softly, then pointed to a small door behind the counter. "We have a storage room. It's not much, but it's warm. You can rest there tonight." My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. That tiny act of kindness felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. I whispered, "Thank you," and for the first time since running away, I felt a flicker of hope. The storage room was cramped, filled with boxes of coffee beans and old equipment, but to me it felt like a sanctuary. The woman, whose name I learned was Clara, brought me a blanket and a pillow. She didn't ask questions, not yet, and I was grateful for that. When she closed the door behind her, I sat on the floor, hugging the blanket tightly around myself. The quiet in that room was different from the quiet at home. This one wasn't suffocating. It wasn't heavy with unspoken threats. It was simply peaceful. I curled up on the thin mat she'd placed for me and let my tired muscles sink into the fabric. I could feel the day catching up with me, the walking, the fear, the uncertainty. My eyelids grew heavy, but my mind wandered. Would my mother wake up and realize I was gone? Would she panic, or would relief wash over her now that she no longer had to face my resistance? Would the old man be angry and come looking for me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. This was one night, one safe night. I needed to survive one day at a time. The hum of the refrigerator outside the storage room lulled me into a strange calm, and I finally drifted into sleep. It was the first night in weeks where my dreams weren't filled with drowning or endless hallways. Instead, I dreamed of running, not from something, but towards something. Light, fresh air, open space, freedom. I woke up to the faint aroma of fresh bread and the sound of low voices from the cafe outside. For a moment, I forgot where I was, the blanket tangled around my legs. When reality settled back in, I felt a mixture of fear and clarity. I wasn't home. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't someone's future possession. I was a girl who had chosen herself. Clara knocked softly before opening the door. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, carrying a small plate with toast and fruit. "Eat something. Nobody thinks clearly on an empty stomach." I murmured a soft thank you as she handed me the plate. She sat on a box nearby, watching me with those perceptive eyes of hers. After a few moments, she finally asked, "Are you running from something?" I hesitated, feeling the familiar tightness in my chest. Part of me wanted to protect my story, to keep it locked away where no one could judge it or use it against me. But another part, the part desperate for kindness, knew I had to trust someone eventually. "I had to leave," I whispered. "It wasn't safe for me anymore." Clara didn't push for details. She simply nodded, as if understanding more than I said. "You can work here for a while," she offered. "Help around the cafe. Earn some money. No questions until you're ready." My throat tightened again, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. She saw something in me, strength, maybe, or the faint glow of survival. For the first time, I felt like I had a place in the world that wasn't tied to obligation or sacrifice. The cafe became my refuge. I started working in the mornings, wiping tables, brewing coffee, sweeping the floor. The customers didn't know my story, and I liked it that way. To them, I was just a quiet girl, with tired eyes and careful hands. Clara guided me patiently, never raising her voice, never demanding more than I could give. The rhythm of the work soothed me, the clink of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the footsteps on worn tiles. It felt like rebuilding myself piece by piece. One afternoon, when the cafe was nearly empty, I caught my reflection in the window. For the first time, I didn't see the frightened girl who had stood in front of an old man's cold smile. I saw someone new, someone braver, stronger, someone who had chosen her own path. But peace was fragile. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, my stomach dropped. I hadn't turned it on in days. My hands trembled as I looked at the screen. Dozens of missed calls, most from my mother, 2 from an unknown number I recognized instantly. Him. My throat tightened as I stared at the notifications, my heart hammering like it wanted to escape my chest. Clara noticed my panic. "You don't have to answer anything you don't want to," she said softly. Her voice grounded me.